As the institution of slavery became more entrenched in colonial societies, the legal framework surrounding race and interracial relationships evolved significantly. Anti-miscegenation laws emerged as a formalized way to regulate and restrict interracial unions, particularly between white Europeans and enslaved Africans or free blacks. These laws were designed to uphold the ideology of racial purity, a concept that gained traction in the 18th and 19th centuries as racial categories became more rigidly defined. The first anti-miscegenation laws in the English colonies can be traced back to the 1660s and 1670s. Virginia was among the first to implement such laws, prohibiting marriages between white individuals and Africans, whether enslaved or free. These early statutes set a precedent for other colonies, leading to a patchwork of regulations that varied by region. The laws not only criminalized interracial marriages, but also prohibited cohabitation and even social interactions between races, reflecting the deep-seated anxieties surrounding racial mixing. As slavery expanded and the economic reliance on enslaved labor grew, so too did the desire to prevent interracial relationships. The rationale behind these laws was rooted in the belief that interracial unions threatened the social fabric of society. Legislators argued that such relationships would lead to the degradation of white society, resulting in a dilution of racial purity. The fears surrounding these unions were further amplified by sensationalist accounts of interracial relationships that painted them as immoral and dangerous. In addition to prohibiting marriages, many colonial laws sought to regulate the relationships between white men and enslaved women. While white men often exercised their sexual power over enslaved women without legal repercussions, laws were put in place to punish enslaved women who were found to have engaged in relationships with white men. These double standards reinforced the idea that white men were entitled to their sexual desires, while black women were dehumanized and treated as mere property. As these laws evolved, they became increasingly complex, incorporating various elements that defined the legal status of individuals involved in interracial relationships. In some regions, the status of the offspring of interracial unions was codified by law. The principle of partus sequitur vent rem, meaning that which is brought forth follows the womb, became a key legal tenet, establishing that the children of enslaved mothers would also be enslaved, regardless of their father's race. This legal principle ensured that the lineage of slavery continued to propagate, effectively making racial identity a matter of birth and maternal lineage. The enforcement of anti-miscegenation laws was often brutal and punitive. Legal systems established severe penalties for individuals who dared to violate these racial boundaries, reflecting the societal consensus that interracial relationships were unacceptable. For those found guilty of engaging in such relationships, the consequences could be dire, ranging from fines and imprisonment to corporal punishment or even death. In the American South, the enforcement of these laws was often carried out by local authorities, who took it upon themselves to monitor and police the social interactions between races. Community vigilance played a critical role in maintaining the racial order, as neighbors and local leaders often reported suspected violations of the laws. The fear of public humiliation and social ostracism was a powerful deterrent against interracial relationships, as individuals risked not only legal punishment but also the loss of their social standing. In some instances, the legal penalties extended beyond the individuals involved in the interracial relationship to include their families and communities. For example, if a white woman was found to have engaged in a relationship with a black man, her family often faced social and legal repercussions. This collective punishment served as a warning to others, reinforcing the idea that interracial relationships posed a threat not just to individuals, but to the larger community and the established social order. The legal framework surrounding interracial relationships was particularly harsh for women, especially enslaved women. Enslaved women who were found to have engaged in relationships with white men faced severe punishment, often including whipping or other forms of physical abuse. Conversely, white men who fathered children with enslaved women were rarely held accountable for their actions. This gender disparity in the enforcement of laws further perpetuated the dehumanization of Black women and reinforced the notion that their bodies were available for exploitation. The legal status of children born from interracial unions was a contentious issue that reflected the complexities of race, property, and social standing. The application of the partus sequitur vint rem principle ensured that the children of enslaved mothers were automatically considered enslaved, regardless of their father's race. This principle reinforced the idea that Blackness was inherited through the maternal line, cementing the social and legal standing of mixed-race individuals in a system that prioritized racial purity. Mixed-race children, often referred to by terms like mulatto, were caught in a precarious position within the racial hierarchy. Their legal status varied depending on the region and the specific laws in place, but they were often subjected to social stigmatization and discrimination. In some cases, mixed-race individuals were able to leverage their ambiguous status to secure greater social mobility or legal rights, particularly in the northern states, where some anti-slavery sentiment allowed for the possibility of freedom and acceptance. However, the realities of racial prejudice and societal discrimination continued to shape their experiences. The social and legal landscape surrounding mixed-race children was further complicated by the perceptions of their identity. In colonial societies, mixed-race individuals often faced scrutiny and suspicion from both white and Black communities. They were seen as embodiments of the social tension surrounding race, often caught between the two worlds and facing discrimination from both sides. This tension was exacerbated by the rigid racial categories that defined colonial society, where individuals were often forced to navigate a complex web of identities. The legal and social norms surrounding interracial relationships were enforced through a combination of formal laws and informal practices. Communities played a critical role in maintaining the racial order, with social pressure often serving as a more effective deterrent than legal penalties alone. The stigma associated with interracial relationships was deeply ingrained in the social fabric, creating an environment where individuals were constantly monitored and judged based on their racial affiliations. Extralegal violence also became a tool for enforcing racial boundaries. In many cases, white vigilante groups took it upon themselves to punish those who violated the racial taboos. Lynching, public shaming, and other forms of violence were often employed to instill fear in those who might consider crossing the racial divide. These acts of brutality served as stark reminders of the consequences of defying societal norms and highlighted the lengths to which communities would go to preserve their racial hierarchies. The combination of legal enforcement, social stigma, and extralegal violence created a pervasive culture of fear and intimidation surrounding interracial relationships. Individuals who dared to defy these norms faced not only legal repercussions, but also the risk of violence and social ostracism. This environment stifled genuine connections between individuals of different races, perpetuating the isolation and dehumanization that characterized the institution of slavery. The legal frameworks and enforcement mechanisms surrounding interracial relationships during slavery were designed to maintain strict racial boundaries and uphold the institution of slavery. Anti-miscegenation laws reflected the deep-seated anxieties surrounding racial mixing, while penalties for violating these laws served to reinforce the power dynamics at play. The status of mixed-race individuals and the brutal enforcement of social norms highlighted the complexities and contradictions inherent in a society built on racial hierarchies. In the next part, we will explore the cultural and social taboos that emerge alongside these legal frameworks, examining the ways in which race and gender intersected in the enforcement of these norms.